Hello, family. Welcome back to another Sister for Sister Storytime session. I'm still reading the book Against the Apocalypse by David G. Rothfuss. Spirit has told me to read a scripture before I start my sessions from now on, so I just opened the book, and today it landed on the book of Esther, chapter 1. Yeah, so I'm just going to read the first chapter. So now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 120 provinces. That in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the third year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days, in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where were white, green, and blue hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rings, and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver, upon a pavement of red, and blue, and white, and black marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law. None did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house, that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Also, Vashti, the queen, made a feast for the women in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Bista, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the royal crown, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the but the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment. And the next unto him was Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Merez, Marcina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat the first in the kingdom. What shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to law? Because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes when it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great. All the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes. And the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Now we'll get back to the meaning of that scripture later on my page, on my Facebook, but we're just going to continue with the book reading for now. Okay. So in the scheme of masculine memory and artistic persuasion, the scene of desecration, the place where the laws of the land and the Torah were violated with impunity, the locus of evil was not St. Petersburg, but the local Kahal chamber and synagogue. It was here, according to Isaac Bayer Levinson, writing in 1851, that 12 pious Jews were forced to swear falsely on the Torah, knowing that a poor man in town had an only son 8 years of age. The witnesses swore that the son was really 12, was one of 7 sons of the rich man in town, and was therefore eminently fit for the draft. In Cantonist times, the practice called akuv hakrir, in which anyone, rich or poor, man or woman, could interrupt the reading of the Torah to demand redress for a wrongdoing, was put to dramatic, if ineffectual use. It seems like that goes right with the scripture I just read. The aggrieved mother whose only son had just been drafted would now be shouted down from the platform, and the reading would continue as if nothing had happened. This is what the masculine A.I. Peperna, Judah Lade Gordon, and Jacob Dennison later remembered. The synagogue Jews were deaf even to the woman in Minsk who cried, Lord of the universe, you take pride in our father Abraham, because he readily sacrificed his son on the altar. Order me to slaughter my only son, and I will do it at once. But could you prevail upon Abraham to give Isaac up for conversion? Both the folk and the masculine of that generation, for very different reasons, turned their anger and their energies inward and absolved the higher authorities, God or the Tsar, of responsibility. The rhymed couplet of this chapter epigraph, which dates from around mid-century, reflects the common man's perception that the Tsar would intervene if only he knew what evils were being perpetrated in his name. It was the internal authority structure, in other words, with its ethos of communal solidarity, which had been so badly shaken by the draft decrees. If Cantonism was a central link in the chain of Jewish suffering, it was because, in the words of one grandmother, not even the Tokeha listed among its curses the possibility of Jews being kidnapped by other pious Jews. The masculine, for their part, had everything pinned on the good graces of the government, which alone could promote the linear progress of history. Had not the government proved its noble intentions by opening 2 rabbinic seminaries for the training of a new enlightened leadership, and were not the teachers and pupils automatically exempt from the draft? No wonder then that in their topical works of fiction and masculine could safely disregard the contradictory evidence. A.B. Gottliber, born 1811, supplied a happy ending to a story of Cantonist times, in violation of what he actually experienced. In the story version, the masculine hero was freed and the evil Kahal deputy was drafted in his stead. Similarly, Gottliber made no mention of the popular uprising against the Kahal, which he witnessed in person, and for lack of a better scapegoat, he blamed the institution of kidnapping on the Hasidism. From anarchy, the pendulum swung to unbridled optimism at the beginning of Alexander II's reign. in 1856. Cantonism was abolished, though capers continued to round up the able bodied until 1874. The serfs were freed, and a limited number of Jews were permitted to settle the interior of Russia. With the easing of censorship, a Jewish periodical press came into its own. In Hebrew, 1856, Russian, 1860, Polish, 1861, and finally in Yiddish, 1862. Through the press, secular literature became institutionalized and diversified. Novels were serialized. Feuilletons on topical issues were featured below the line, that is, on the bottom half of the page. Writers learned to differentiate their audience according to language, and literary persona made their first appearance. The writers of this second generation made their name in the Jewish press. Judah Leib Gordon, born 1830, Shalom Yankev Abramovich, born 1836, Peretz Smolenskin, born 1842, Abraham Yuri Kovner, born 1842, and Moses Leib Lindblom, born 1843. Smolenskin even published and edited his own newspaper. As a generation attuned to contemporary Russian thought, these writers closely monitored the apparent groundswell of liberalism and heeded the call of the positivists that art be connected with real life and that literature seek to redress the ills of society. More sharply than before, the masculine pen aimed inward at the cultural backwardness of the nation, the ossified religious practices, and the lack of effective leadership. The central problem of the 1860s, as the Jewish intellectuals saw it, was how to preserve a rational form of Jewishness within a framework of Gentile acceptance. Only much later, when the Tsarist reaction and reform had already gone through more cycles, did a Russian Jewish intellectual of the third generation, Ben Ami, born 1854, discover this analogy. The Inquisition perpetrated terrible things. It subjected the body of the adult Jew to torture, but he was able to laugh proudly at his persecutor while keeping his soul and his conscience free of defect or fear, and in order to save his body, could don the filthy skin of his persecutor and executioner. The capers tore little children from the arms of their mothers and gave them over, not to the inquisitors, but to drunken soldiers, so that they be raised as Christians. Ben Ami's leap from the recent to the distant past necessarily overlooked the difference between the zeal of the Inquisition to enforce absolute religious purity and Tsar Nicholas's single-minded pursuit of converts. But who could bother with the fine points when the age of the cantonists was taken into account? Young boys ages 8 to 18 hardly stood a chance against forced marches in midwinter, brutal military discipline, a diet of pork, and permanent exile. The Cantonist era left a legacy of 50,000 lost children. These guinea pigs of modernity, the masculine and the small group of Russian Jews who won acceptance by society in the 1860s, were also the first to feel its rod of chastisement. The carrot and the stick were administered in the remote setting of Odessa, the El Dorado of the South, where God himself, as the folk put it, lived the life of Riley. Odessa or Hadessa, like Esther. There, at the end of May 1871, a pogrom of major proportions gave Russian Jews a preview of things to come. The 1.5 million rubles in property damage was bad enough. Worse was the fact that the Greek rioters, angry at being displaced by Jews in the city's economic and political life, preferred to destroy property rather than steal, for this was a measure of their anti-Jewish hatred. Worse still was that the police stood by and watched. And finally, there was the sense of betrayal. Local non Jewish intellectuals and progressive public opinion blamed the pogrom on the Jews themselves. The shockwaves of Jewish destruction would always register strongest among those who hoped for goodwill and common sense among their Christian allies. The timing of the violence remained unchanged from generations past. April and May would continue to be the cruelest months for the Jews of Eastern Europe, whether by virtue of the Easter festival and its proximity to Passover, or by virtue of some demonic force that exacted its human sacrifice with the coming of spring. The Christian rabble, remarked Peretz Smolenskin, needs Jewish blood to mark the festival of Passover. The springtime of ritual murder would blossom again in 1881, 1903, and 1943. The peculiar interplay of history and myth, of violent time that somehow conspired to fit a larger pattern of natural time, was only one reason the moderns would seek long and hard for effective secular means to take in the theme of Jewish catastrophe. The liturgical models of prophecy, midrash, piyut, or synagogue poetry, and chronicle had placed greater stress on the repeatability of the pattern as it confirmed the archetypes and had ignored the time specific location of the catastrophic event. The moderns reversed the emphasis, stressing the event itself, its social and political context. Within a very few years of the Odessa pogrom, two very different literary approaches emerged from the ranks of the Eastern European intelligentsia. One applied modern methods rather mechanically to produce the first pogrom novel ever written. The other, obviously more important for my thesis, revolutionized the liturgical model to treat the pogrom as metaphysical allegory. The novel would have seemed an obvious choice, first because it encouraged repertorial accuracy in the writer, second because of the greater leniency of the censors who read works of fiction more carelessly than journalistic treatments of the same theme, and third because the plot of the novel was tailor-made for adventure in the metropolis. Murder and intrigue were the stuff of all Hebrew novels at the time, regardless of their subject matter. So no one would look askance at myriad subplots complete with forged letters, attempted poisonings, and romantic triangles. The pogrom novel, as understood by its popularizers, made order out of chaos by imposing a single schematic plot. Murder and mobs in the big city gave dramatic weight to an otherwise predictable love story of an exemplary Jewish woman and a compassionate Gentile man, a pattern later to be followed by Yiddish novelists from Shalom Aleichem to Shalom Asch, and by continental movie makers from Jerry Wise to Vittorio De Sica. Yekutiel Berman, last seen traveling in Caper country with a loaded revolver, serialized the first pogrom novel ever written in Smolenskin's Vienna-based newspaper before issuing it in book form. The actual contours of the Odessa pogrom allowed Berman to enlarge upon the details of intrigue, such as the Greek merchants sending to the homeland for reinforcements and especially lethal stones. But such exclusive focus on the perfidy of the Greeks, all of whom got their just deserts, localized the event and neutralized its implications. And then there was the biblical proof text. Calling the pogromists the ravagers at noon, he applied the words of Joel 4 and 6. And you have sold the people of Judah and the people of Jerusalem to the Ionians. In a literal sense, Ionians meant Greeks, unlike the way in which Yevonim meant Russian. Smolenskin, Berman's publisher, took a bolder approach, using the Odessa pogrom to issue a call for self-defense. But the protagonist's heroic stance in the pogrom, coming as it did at the end of a torturous four-part novel, could not seem to be anything but a convenient way of killing him off. Thus, modern novelistic means, which placed such a premium of immediacy, factuality, character, and plot did not necessarily guarantee a more adequate contextual understanding of the emergent crisis in Russia than did the traditional laments, sermons, and sacred tales. Allegory proved a far more effective method, especially at the hands of a master at camouflage. In The Mare, or Pity the Poor Animal, S.Y. Abram, Abramovich alerted readers with an epigraph from the Song of Songs, itself the subject of allegorical interpretation at least since the times of Rabbi Akiva. The steed in Pharaoh's chariots, 1 and 9, was none other than the people of Israel. Only the censor failed to identify this book as the most far reaching, intellectually challenging, and subversive work in all of 19th century Jewish literature, a mistake not to be repeated 18 years later when a Russian periodical ran a translation of the novel by the author's son. Publication was stopped after the third installment and the journal was forced to close. By then, Die Klyachi, the Mare, had become a household word. The pogrom sequence was the least of it. The Mare was a study in exploitation, the major theme of Maskilic satire, which was now expanded to encompass the social inequalities in Jewish society, the political repression in the empire, and ultimately the dualistic struggle between the forces of good and evil. Satan, Ashmedai, in Jewish lore, the king of demons, appeared in person to represent the Tsar, political repression throughout Europe, and the energy for evil in the cosmos. Not too long before, Abramovich had shared in the euphoric hopes for a new era of reform and enlightenment. By the 1870s, some of his generation were beginning to break faith with the Haskalah, or Enlightenment, often under the impact of Russian positivism. But nowhere was the indictment of society so global and the despair so inescapable as in this masterpiece of allegorical persuasion. Among the Haskalah's central tenets that Abramovich repudiated was the political realignment of the Jews with the forces of liberalism, a thesis originally advanced by Moses Mendelssohn in 1783 in his political tract Jerusalem. Abramovich despaired first of the enlightened despotism of the Tsar, and then more radically of the Russian liberals, or the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, in his allegorical code, whose duplicity toward the Jews was second only to their powerlessness. The Enlightenment, according to Abramovich, had produced a class of Jewish intellectuals like Yisraelik, the hero of the Mare, who were now left with no alternative but to return home. The masculine were cut off from both worlds. At best, they could be prevailed upon not to perpetuate the cycle of exploitation. The hero's madness was Abram Ovich, I cannot say that word, vehicle for pointing to the maddening effect the world was having on the Jews. Ashmedai took special pride in the pogroms, blood libels, and Jewish hate literature of his creatures down below, but never to the exclusion of other, more universal forms of evil. In the early version of the Mare, written in the year of the Odessa pogrom, but referring nowhere to it by name, the description of bloodthirsty mobs wrecking Jewish homes and murdering Jewish infants appeared alongside other instances of inhumanity. If you're tired of seeing the misery that others inflict upon you, Ashmedai says to the hero at the end of the original pogrom chapter, I'll show you the great misery that you inflict upon one another. The final version, written during the first decade of the 20th century, had Ashmedai extend his tour to include an apocalyptic landscape of industrial blight and military devastation. Abramovich defined the problem of conflict ever more globally, and in this work at least began to posit the impossibility of leading a moral existence in a world predicated on exploitation. The mayor was as far as Abramovich ever dared go. He dropped his ambitious plans for a madman's library and abandoned his crazy narrator for being too bleak, too negative, and too modern. Meanwhile, the devil's work proceeded brilliantly, transforming Russian society into a veritable madhouse of reactionary rulers, rioting peasants, and frenzied revolutionaries, with the Jews caught totally unprepared and unprotected. The pogrom wave of 1881 to 82, the first in the history of Tsarist Russia, took a far greater toll than loss of life, negligible by later standards, or extensive property damage in over 200 different locations in the southeast. It destroyed the faith of three generations of Russian Jews and created a groundswell of unprecedented discontent. Abramovich's equilibrium, already readjusted several times over, was badly shaken, but unlike Smolenskin, Lillienblum, and others, he had no new political programs to offer on the ruins of the old. Unique among the writers of his age, he stopped writing. This period of tribulation for Jews, he explained in a letter from Odessa in 1882, that has called forth so many scribblers and petty patriots from among our ranks, has had an opposite effect on me and set upon my lips the seal of silence. The push and pull of catastrophe, which sent estranged Jews like Leo Pinsker rushing back to the fold and sent others running for cover to America, to Palestine, to the soil, to social revolution, all this struck Abramovich with a mixture of sorrow and scorn. The writer laureate of the Pale was reduced to temporary silence. An innovator of such talent who had already tried just about everything, the sentimental and picaresque novel, romance and the novel of education, drama and verse, allegory and essay, might have been expected to reemerge, if at all, with something new, something commensurate with the radically changing times. Instead, in what proved to be a cultural development of paramount importance for Eastern European Jewry of the 19th century, Abramovich resurrected his old standby, the cantankerous, unpredictable figure of Mendel the book peddler. Here was a character invented back in 1864 who had none of Yisraelik's higher aspirations, who was too busy hawking his Jewish books and religious objects to be bothered with ultimate questions of chaos and cosmos. In compensation, he was far better equipped than a Yisraelik to deal with the internal dynamics of Jewish life. The peddler was on intimate terms with his clientele. In the Pale of Jewish settlements, he was as well known as a counterfeit kopeck. Despite a penchant for traveling, Mendel was no picaro. He was a dutiful husband and father and a caring, considerate master to his long suffering horse. If nonetheless his money bounced in the marketplace of tradition, it was mainly because he took rather perverse pleasure in the seductions of nature, and because among the newfangled books in his wagon there were some that he himself had discovered, edited, rewritten, even authored. Still, the question remains, why Mendel? Why, at a time of upheaval, should Abramovich have returned to that which was so familiar? Precisely because others had the answers and Abramovich didn't. Because traumatic though the pogroms were, he was unwilling to isolate the present course of history from that which had come before. Because despite his earlier indictment, he refused in the name of Jewish nationalism to discard modernity out of hand, to spit in the well of enlightenment which he and the other young men of his day had drunk from so thirstily. Because when all was said and done, Jews remained one great contradiction. And no one, as we shall see, embodied that dialectical passion better than Mendel. As a consummate artist and arbiter of Jewish taste, Abramovich preferred updating the old to generating something entirely new. From now on, his best efforts were channeled into a grand literary enterprise of recasting and translating his entire earlier corpus. His spectacular comeback in Hebrew was built on 20 years of prior achievement in Yiddish. The new Mer became a midrash on the old. Mendel was reborn to retrace his own steps. Of the three main stops on Mendel's normal route, Idler Junction, Pauperville, and Foolstown, the last endured through the years unscathed. Pleasurable laughter hovers over my lips at this moment. When I call the name of Salon before you, a laughter announcing peace and heralding good fortune, Isaiah 52 and 7. Let my brothers, the far and the near, Isaiah 57:19, at sea or on land, be informed that Salon, our mother, still lives. Praise be his name. Like second Isaiah announcing to his sorely tested nation that the redemption of Zion had begun, Mendel brought word 5 years after the pogrom that Ceylon had survived the ravages of time. And a good thing, too, because no place was more central to Abramovich fictional geography than the commercial metropolis of Foolstown, ingeniously derived from the obscure biblical place name Ceylon in Joshua 15 and 10, but also playing on the Hebrew word for fool, kasil. The Hebrew reader was not the Hebrew reader was meant to recognize the town from its earlier incarnation as groups, no, notably in such works as Fish, the Lame, and the Travels of Benjamin. 3. The change to Hebrew allowed for a density of allusion that Abramovich would henceforth reserve for openers and other special occasions. In this passage, the pseudo-biblical parallelism and the repetition of verbs of the form BSR to herald, inform, announce tell the male reader of Hebrew, since women did not read Hebrew fiction in those days, that Salon is being measured on a scale of absolute holiness. Prophetic language elevates Salon to the city of God, the celestial Zion, whereas the description that follows bespeaks a crowded, filthy, gaudy, dilapidated, and stagnant reality. In short, business as usual. Pauperville, Capsiels, Capsaints, on the other hand, has suffered greatly, and in the second part of the story, written in 1887, we meet Mendel coming from the synagogue in a particularly spiritual frame of mind, only to have his penitential mood cut short by the sudden appearance of a peasant making off with his one and only horse. Mendel cries for help and is knocked unconscious. On recuperating several days later, he tries to get a sense of what has happened. What disturbs him most, driving him virtually into a state of frenzy, is the pathetic attempts of his family and friends to put on a happy face. Mendel deals with their passivity in the wake of the pogrom by invoking a hallowed response and turning it on its head. He wishes that he could take up one of the harps by the waters of Babylon and play an ecstatic tune mixed with sorrow, so that suffering Jews might dance until they dashed themselves in madness against the rocks. When I saw the unfortunate members of my household holding back their pain with friendly smiles in order to calm me down, I turned my face to the wall and I wept. The local peasantry had staged a pogrom, and the Jews of Capsiel were helpless to retaliate and too passive even to shout. Denied their cathartic protest, they were robbed of their reparations as well. Nothing could be done to prosecute the rabble, since the crime had been redefined as a revolt of the peasant masses rising to do battle against the exploiting class, the Jews. The spoils of war were not prescribed by law, and the victims were lucky not to be prosecuted instead. In this story, enigmatically titled In the Secret Place of Thunder, after Psalms 81 and 8, Mendel was made to confront the futility of sorrow and sentiment. The standard repertoire of lament, like Psalm 137, could be used only if turned against itself. Nothing but parody could do justice to this grotesque war waged against the penniless by the equally downtrodden. Only parody could burlesque the facile rhetoric of those official poets who had sprouted like mushrooms in this time of national penance to compose the requisite dirge on the destruction of Capsiel. And then there was Gimple, the local servant who could channel the rhetoric into pipe dreams of national revival. Mendel found himself torn between tirade and tears. Yet to stifle one's feelings led to madness. Witness the fate of Israel, whose anger was always misdirected. Mendel's equilibrium was restored thanks to his open anger, his ability to give free rein to sacrilege, to unleash the darker side of himself. Mendel's underlying optimism was fueled by his outrage. In Abramovich, as in no other writer before him, the tension between contempt and compassion became not only the subject but the very substance of his art. The shattered tablets and flying letters were the sole remains of Jewish life. Abramovich came to see all of existence in terms of binary oppositions, of the acute tension between the sublime and the ridiculous, flux and stagnation, the human in animals and the animal in man, between me and them, nature and nation. From where Abramovich stood, the pogroms had intensified the screaming contradictions of human and Jewish existence, making the swing between pathos and parody ever more sudden and extreme. Mendel was the master disassembler. Because he was not a full blown, psychologically definable character, his very unpredictability mediated the most diverse perspectives. Abramovich re enlisted his services in these later stories because only a Mendel who embodied the contradictions of Jewish life could negotiate the political sloganeering coming from one side and the stifled sobbing coming from the other, then see his way clear to a reasonable course of action. Abramovich had made his most radical political and existential statement in The Mayor, in rebuttal to the reigning optimism of the 1860s. Now, in the third and fourth decades of his career, Abramovich reacted to the secular messianism of the new generation by steering a moderate course between apologetics and skepticism. Whatever platform Mendel advanced in Abramovich's name, a conciliatory view of the Gentile lower classes as victims of circumstance or an outright rejection of Zionism did not distinguish him from other spokesmen of Russian Jewry. Rather, it was the way Mendel operated that mattered, that precarious, outrageous blend of the sacred and profane, that double edge that burlesqued the greatness of Israel, even as it affirmed it in the most hallowed terms. His ability at the end of In the Secret Place of Thunder to sing a psalm of return, here I will make my home, for such is my desire. Psalms 132 and 14. To extol not the virtues of Zion, but those of Solon Glup's Foolstown, the debased center of Israel in its Russian diaspora. This was the vital link between the traditional and the modern Jewish literary responses to catastrophe. With Mendel, we leave the faithful mime behind forever and enter into contract with his cynical counterpart, whereas sacred parody had a limited, thoroughly ritualized place in the medieval and rabbinic periods. Sacrilegious parody becomes dominant in the modern age. Several reasons can be deduced for this, all of which have direct bearing on Mendel's achievement. As the Russian formalists discovered, and as recent Israeli criticism has reconfirmed, parody comes to the fore whenever literary norms atrophy and become routine. Writers use parody to unmask the artificiality in the accepted conventions and to argue for radical change. Moreover, as we learn from Israel Davidson's pioneering survey of Jewish parody, nothing was considered too sacred for 19th century Jewish reforms, east, west, and across the ocean. It was as if Purim, with its sanctioned call for parody and drunkenness, were now being celebrated all year long. But most important for the subject at hand is the setting in which sacred parody originally appeared in Lamentations. There we saw the individual survivors whose suffering pulled them away from the collective just long enough to be freed of its patterned response. It was then that they felt the betrayal most acutely and were able to express their sense of outrage by doing violence to the sacred text. Even after the survivors rejoined the ranks, the parodied text would never be the same. Henceforth, it would always carry with it the pain of that momentary defiance. Thus, by absorbing the experience of atrocity in the present, the text could also anticipate the future. The Akedah as mass martyrdom, the giving of the Torah as its desecration, the prayer for rain as the poisoning of the wells. Mendel clearly operates with a different set of rules. He is out to attack everything that is stagnant and cliched in Jewish society, whether traditionalist or modern. Mendel's norm, as Myron has shown, lies outside the system, in nature or in the freedom of individual movement, not in any sacred source or in Jewish society as presently constituted. After Mendel is through with the attack, there will be nothing left but shards and a mandate to regroup and rebuild on the basis of new and different norms. Mendel, like the paradigmatic survivor, is also a loner, but with an Eastern European Jewish twist. He never retreats into solipsism or isolated range for too long. How else could he earn a living after all? Dependence on the very customers who so infuriate him is precisely what sets him into action. He speaks their language or languages better than they do. He knows them inside out and can take them by surprise. He joins them in order to wreak havoc from within and stands apart in order to recruit for the next round. Mendel is the quick change artist par excellence whose variety of parodic roles singles him out among the unambiguous voices of 19th century Eastern Europe and define his pivotal position among the writers of following generations. Abramovich sent his book peddler back into action following the silent years of the early 1880s because he wished to capture the tragicomic circumstances of Russian Jewry in the figure of this wandering old timer doing the circuit year after year, trapped by his trade and his creed in a closed and self destructing world. Within these strictures, Mendel thrived on the freedom to question everything that came his way, to work against those whose words he presumed to report, and to subvert the very works he was supposed to be promoting. If anything, his field of activity had been greatly expanded by the altogether revolutionary feat of his speaking in Hebrew in a new synthetic prose style combining all strata of the language. Abramovich turned the limitations of a classical idiom to his advantage by allowing Mendel to subvert the elusive qualities of biblical, rabbinic, and liturgical phrases. Every word was potentially explosive if properly abused. In Mendel's hands, Talmudic hair splitting and sacrilegious wordplay became prerequisites for self emancipation. For 11 years, from 1886 to 1897, Mendel's travels took him back to the old haunts, but also along routes never taken before. If anyone could, this man would find a method in the madness of history. In 1890, Mendel decided to travel for the first time by train, and in so doing, tested his wits against two of the most radical isms of the modern age: nationalism and political anti Semitism. The trip was portentous from the start. It is not the voice of them that flee from a fire, neither is it the voice of them that run from armed bandits. It is the noise of Jews that congregate upon the train station of Salon that is heard on high. Capitalization does not begin to convey the shock of recognizing in Mendel's opening words Moses' famous outcry as he descended from the mountain to find the children of Israel dancing around the golden calf, Exodus 32 and 18, as well as bits and snatches from Isaiah 29 and 8 and Jeremiah 31 and 15. The art of quotation in this passage works to overturn the original sacred text. The sacred language of God and man is here applied to the grossly physical reality of men and men so that the latter may cancel out the former. This highly elusive wordplay, which was deemed impossible to translate, actually sets the metaphoric stage. The Jews, with bundles in their hands and on their shoulders, push and shove for a place in the third class train compartment, while the Gentile passengers are strolling up and down the hallway in front of the station with their luggage and waiting until the bell rings for a second or even a third time, when they will mount the train at leisure and each proceed to his appointed place. All this can be likened to an unredeemed rite of exile. The sense of desecration is carried further by prophetic echoes denouncing the idols of Baal that boweth and stoopeth, Isaiah 46, 1 to 2, the wealthy who exploit the nation, thrusting with side and with shoulder against the weak, Ezekiel 34 and 21, and the sound of Rachel's weeping that is heard on high, Jeremiah 31 and 15. Still, more disturbing are the counter echoes, those memorable phrases that recall God's glories and the Exodus in particular. The bundles they carry upon their shoulders, Exodus 12 and 34. They're fighting for places in the congested train with a mighty and outstretched arm, Deuteronomy 4 and 34. And finally, the bundles and bedding that mount up on either side of the compartment, forming a wall for me on my right and on my left, Exodus 14 and 22, like the waters of the Red Sea. The weight of this bleak analogy is by no means carried by allusions alone, though they certainly provide much of its power. Travel is a metaphor for history. The old coach ride that Mendel so much preferred represents the traditional journey of a people in the world, whereas their modern experience can be likened to the class distinctions on board a train. Even before boarding, Jews and Gentiles are automatically distinguished, the ones worried and always pushing to get ahead, the others slow and dignified as befits their privileged status in society. Once inside, they submit to the social segregation of classes and sects. The change of travel from coach to train has brought about commensurate changes in human behavior. The majestic sweating of a free man on board a coach is the very image of natural man who retains his basic goodness, his freedom of choice, his sense of oneness with others and with nature. Train travel upsets the harmonious balance. Nature is fragmented by speed, which blinds the passenger to the handiwork of God. Confined within the artificial boundaries of a train, man becomes alienated from his own sweat. Miraculously, however, Jews are able to thrive in this moving, deafening, overcrowded prison, transforming their seething environment into a kingdom of sorts, a huckster's market. Mendel, too, gets drawn into a feverish barter on the train as one form of contract gives rise to another. He begins to take notice of his neighbors, exiles he discovers from Prussia via Lithuania. And so the innocent trip from Ceylon takes on several layers of meaning. Mendel's discomfort is the anomie wrought by industrialization. The plight of Reb or Mr. Moshe and his family represents the fate of defenseless minorities in the modern nation state. and all those Jews crowded into the third class compartment en route to nowhere and vying with each other along the way are the symbolic equivalents of an exodus dead ended. The perverted proof texts start to fly whenever Mendel runs afoul of the Jews acting as a collective, which is to say, wheeling and dealing. But when faced with instances of individual sorrow, his family in Capsiel trying to cover up the pogrom of Reb Moshe and his family fighting off their hunger, he is moved to tears. It is now Mendel's turn to act as the foil for others. He advocates in favor of Reb Moshe as soon as discussion turns to foreign relations. This points to another reason for the trains being such an ideal fictional setting. The friendship born of reciprocal need that binds Reb Moshe to the Polish Catholic cobbler could not have been found on Mendel's normal route, just as the politics of anti Semitism that came between them lay as yet outside the pale. As a man of simple faith, Reb Moshe uses proof text only in support of his arguments, whether to unmask political anti Semitism as a throwback to antediluvian times or gently to rebuke his Bible quoting friend Japheth with appropriate wisdom from Proverbs. True to his name, Moshe Moses, the pious Lithuanian tailor, eventually delivers a new Torah, which Mendel then commits to writing. The homiletic logic of this story requires that everything be anchored in the biblical past, in the best rabbinic tradition of paring history down to its constituent archetypes, Train as exile, Shem and Japheth as Jew and Pole, modern anti Semitism as the evil that brought about the flood. Like Moses, Reb Moshe has struggled with God after being rebuffed by those to whom he looks for brotherhood. The revelation comes when Japheth, too, is cast into exile, making him a ready candidate to receive a debased but utilitarian Torah of survival handed down from those who were schooled in adversity since Second Temple time. Now that some Gentiles or members of superfluous minorities are also reduced to traveling without tickets in the third class purgatorial compartment, Jews have something useful to teach them. They can once again be a light unto the nation. On disembarking, Mendel finds out that Japheth has indeed learned his lesson well. It is he who bribes the railway official not to collect fares for the remainder of the trip. Two competing time schemes vie in the course of this momentous journey. It seems at first that the inexorable movement of history has turned the tables on Mendel, reducing him to a naive observer, ignorant of the social and political developments that stare him in the face. Never having heard the name before, he thinks Bismarck is some quack doctor, and when asked about the age we're living in, Mendel pulls out his trusty Jewish calendar. By trip's end, however, Mendel's naivety and Reb Moshe's faith have undercut the evil pretense of modernity. Scripture and halakha, albeit debased, triumph morally over the exercise of raw powder in the name of false science. Mendel has never been more optimistic than when he takes leave of Japheth studying Torah in the tents of Shem at the end of this ironic midrash on survival in a divided world. Shem and Japheth on the train works as a sermon because the alien surroundings cramp Mendel's normal argumentative style and hold his anger in check. So long as he plays the foil, Mendel's satiric voice gives way to Reb Moshe's voice of ironic consolation. Once on native ground, Mendel resumes the task of portraying his Jews in a grotesque light, scoring his best points against their most common traits and activities. But uncommon things are beginning to happen to make even his own turf seem as alien as the inside of a train. Not too long before, a lone adventurer like Benjamin of Tunayadkiv Talon, Idler Junction had set out for distant places, but whole Jewish communities were now on the move, driven by fires, expulsion, and the fear of pogroms. Was this real change? Was the Jewish monolith finally being toppled to be replaced by a healthy, responsive body politic? Could could the new prescriptions put Humpty Dumpty together again, or would the inertia of generations resist any new redemptive claims put forward in the people's name? Mendel was sent by his author to find out, assuming in each case the appropriate role to parody both sides in the controversy. It was a time of fly by night messiahs, of prodigal sons who returned from their worldly pursuits with elaborate schemes for the redemption of their benighted brethren. What better place to enter the fray than in the preface to one such success story, The Wishing Ring, or In the Vale of Tears by Herschel of Popperville. Mendel announces Herschel's arrival on the scene in the crowning invocation of his career, couched in the most hallowed words of consolation from Isaiah and from the Kaddish. Praised and revered by his holy name for the great privilege he has conferred on me, poor sinner that I am, to be his messenger and hasten to bring these holy congregations the good tidings. Mazel tov to you, Capsiel. Congratulations to you, Talon. Best of luck to you, Salon. How fortunate and how happy the three of you are, for your iniquity is expiated. 40 and 2. For lo, your delivery is coming, 62 and 11, God willing, speedily and soon. Raised high above his flock, Mendel the harbinger sees the grand design behind their suffering. These three holy congregations have endured trials born of love and deeds of great courage that will redound to their glory forever. They have undergone a martyrdom of hunger, and by conquering their passion for food and similar gross appetites, without which other people, ordinary mortals, cannot exist, they have proved themselves worthy descendants of the original triad of martyred communities, Spire, Worms, and Mains. In what has aptly been described as a gigantic messianic farce, Mendel unmasked the fallen, indeed monstrous reality of Jewish life. The Kehillah Kadosha is nothing more than a starving bunch of Jews. The notion of their martyrdom only sanctifies their passivity. These last appearances of Mendel's were made at a time when much more was at stake than ever before. This was not Mendel Leffin spoofing the naive hero worship of the Hasidism, not the masculine of the 1850s, using their privileged status as partners in Tsarist reform plans to attack the feudal state, the feudal structure of the Kahal, not the writers of the 1860s and 1870s crying after the fact over the fate of the poor children. This was a struggle for the soul of a nation that, for the first time, was faced with a real choice between exodus and revolution. Abramovich remained skeptical to the end. The positivist in him rejected both the old and the new pieties that barred a rational understanding of the root causes and militated against effective action. Chief among these surrogate structures were a newly revived messianic myth, attacked brilliantly in his preface of 1888, and a recent surge of interest in the annals of the past, the cult of history, which he challenged with equal vigor in 1897. In the same way that Messianism legitimated the intolerable status quo, the traditions of Jewish response to catastrophe were themselves at fault for providing Jews with a ready answer for every catastrophic occasion. Just as Mendel entered the messianic fray in the guise of Isaiah, he approached the Leidensgeschichte, the history of suffering of Russian Jewry, as something of an amateur historian. What I am about to relate to you now, my friends, took place in the very year after the great conflagration in the Holy Congregation of Pauperville. The fire was recorded for all ages to come in the community chronicle, and the Jews of Popperville began to reckon each and every event in their life according to the year of the calamity. Thus, for example, they say that a man was born, was married, or buried so many years after the fire. The ban against yarmulkes, the decree requiring the certification of teachers, the death of the children because of the sinfulness of the town, the epidemic, the forcible cleaning of the ritual bath and of the polluted river, all took place so many years after the tragic fire. There are still some old folks around from the time of that fire, and whenever they sit around at dusk behind the stove in the study house and tell about it, youngsters thirstily drink in their words while tears flow from their eyes. What Jews string together in the chain of catastrophes turn out to be little more than benevolent czar's decrees designed for the improvement of their lot. They ascribe the death of their children to laxity in religious observance, and the epidemic gets lumped to civic ordinances to clean up the bath and the river, a not too subtle indication of how the epidemic got started in the first place. The reckoning of births, deaths, and marriages according to a local time scheme is indeed characteristic of traditional societies, and one would expect the Ukrainian peasants living around Popperville to do the same. What Jews have added is the stamp of literacy. Everything is recorded for all ages to come in the Pinks or Community Chronicle, and the legacy of destruction is passed down to link generations in one saga of shared experience. The nature of the primal event is still unknown, but judged by the company it keeps, it may prove to be less than cataclysmic. Mendel now pulls out other tricks to buttress his own authority in anticipation of the face off. As a perpetual wanderer and child of the shtetl, he is an expert on Jewish life. As a literateur, he can pass judgment on the newspapers which capitalize on death and suffering, filled as they are with reports of deserted wives, eulogies of this one and that, and heart-rending descriptions of the latest fire. Finally, as a man of nature, he and his Jewishness are one. For a change, on this day of Lag BaOmer, the late spring festival that allows the mourning period between Passover and Shavuot to be interrupted with weddings and the enjoyment of fresh air. On such a day, it is all right for him to respond to the forest he is passing through, and on such a day, he is even inspired by the sights and sounds of the Jewish festivities taking place back home. Suddenly, he comes upon the inhabitants of his hometown. They are on the march, hungry, thirsty, tattered, and torn. What happened to you, my brethren? They replied with one voice, our city is no more. We are the citizens of Capseel, and Capseel is no more. Destruction from Shaddai has come. A voice of weeping was heard from the women, a visitation from his holy name. The Lord was very angry with Capseel. Others added with a sigh, because of our many sins, men took up the refrain. Because of our sins, the soot in the chimneys took fire. In addition to these direct quotations from Isaiah 13 and 6 and Zechariah 1 and 2, there follows a barrage of biblical echoes that raises the local fire to mythic status. When Mendel interrupts them for the facts, it emerges that abominable sanitation and cramped housing were the actual causes. Undaunted, the Jews of Capseel conclude with an unbeatable combination of proof texts to justify their negligence. The truth is in accord with the biblical verse, if the Lord watcheth not the city, vain are the efforts of the watchman. Psalms 127 and 1. If the Lord had sent a fire from on high, Lamentations 1 and 13, many waters cannot quench it. Song of Songs 8 and 7, to which Mendel can only bow his head in temporary defeat. No wisdom, No understanding, no counsel can prevail against it. A biblical passage, Proverbs 21 and 30. The Jews of Catziel have won the first round. Mendel, meanwhile, is drawn into the pathetic panorama of dissolution that unfolds before his eyes. But no sooner do the Capsielites begin squabbling over the territory to be staked out for their begging than Mendel resumes his adversarial role, and the biblical echoes clash with the context once again. As the Israelites apportioned their tribal inheritance, the people of Capseel planned their conquest. Even those who never had any property considered themselves eligible for reparation. As deft as this sparring between Mendel and the Jewish collective may be, it is but a warm up for the last round. Mendel, feeling the full force of the tragedy when he is confronted by a helpless infant, rises from his sudden anguish to deliver the final blows. I was driven mad by the sight of my eyes, he exclaims in the words of the Mosaic curses, and then launches into a passionate appeal for self help and self respect. For Mendel, the Jewish body politic is more than a figure of speech. Who is like your people Israel, a unique nation on earth, 2 Samuel 7 and 23, whose members are like limbs of a single body entwined one with the other. But what good is this solidarity when it extends only to the act of suffering? Everyone wants credit for having been a victim of the fire. Everyone wants a place in the grand pageant of Jewish martyrology. Thus prophesies Bendel, mustering the concluding words of Jacob in Genesis 49 and 1 and of Moses, Deuteronomy 32, for not coming forth with immediate substantive aid, the Jewish communities will pay double later. The victims will not recover, and the communal kitty will be milked dry until, in the end of days, the whole house of Israel will raise a great lament over the conflagration. His words have no effect. The truth of his prediction comes home to him later, years later, when he meets a lone survivor from his town, none other than Lazarel the madman, sounds like Lazarus, rushing about the streets of Salon with the children in fast pursuit, laughing at him and screaming. In Mendel's final analysis, the life of the collective dragged everyone down with it. The surfeit of tradition made it harder to act effectively. Destruction and dislocation would not bring about a substantive change because Jews knew too well how to exploit their suffering. Any momentary gains for group solidarity, the children sitting by to take in the words of past tribulations, the paupers leaving in mass to recoup their losses, were more than offset by the centrifugal forces that catastrophe unleashed, which were greed, self interest, and parasitism. Though the fire had taken place sometime in the hoary past, its lessons were very much of the present. The new generation of Russified intellectuals, men like Ben Ami, born 1854, and S. Frug, born 1860, were especially prone to invoke the judgment of history as if the record of past persecutions and the doctrine of historical progress were the only moral reference points against which the behavior of Israel's enemies could be called to account. Rebutting them in his own voice in 1902, Abramovich had this to say: the history of Jewish persecution could not be the basis for a modern Jewish identity because, among other reasons, the preoccupation with death and destruction would backfire sooner or later and turn Jewish youth against its bloody heritage. The vision of Zion, similarly stripped of its spiritual dimensions, was equally barren ground. Abramovich by this time was launching a rearguard action to reaffirm the essential unity of God, Israel, and the Torah. Alas, without Mendel to effect the union, these words carried little rhetorical weight. The balancing act, it seems to me, could no longer be sustained. Like so many later innovators, Abramovich was forced to succumb to the pressures of history. He himself took to writing works of consolation and lament, sans equivocation and sans reproach. When asked by Shalom Aleichem to contribute to a special fundraising volume for the victims of the Kishinev pogrom, Abramovich came out with a stylized chronicle, The Discovery of Volhynia, designed to comfort his readers with the record of a prior migration to the south of Russia when conditions in the north had become intolerable. And when the pogroms hit home in the 69th year of his life, Abramovich experienced all the terrors of hiding in a cellar and of counting the dead and wounded who were assembled in the Jewish school that he ran in Odessa. Abramovich took ill immediately thereafter and, on the advice of his doctors, left for Switzerland. It stands to reason that the drastic revision of the wishing ring done in Switzerland reflects the change that Abramovich underwent as a result of the pogrom. The celebrated prologue, in which Mendel mediated most brilliantly between Herschel, the traveling Messiah, and the sorely tested folk, was moved to the end of the story, an openly sentimental epilogue in which the traveler returned to his devastated home of Pauperville. His spirit broken by what he saw, Herschel could do little more than recite Kaddish for the pogrom victims while Mendel stood by in silence. From the temporary to the terminal silence of Mendel, the book peddler, Russian Jewry was turned inside out. The centrifugal forces that had been gathering momentum in the Cantonist era were now scattering millions of Jews across the globe and driving those who remained to seek ever more radical solutions to the nation's plight. Very little of this revolutionary turmoil comes through in works of 19th century Jewish literature because there were so few available forums. No Yiddish newspaper appeared in all of Tsarist Russia in the 1870s and 1890s, and viable literary forms, not to mention the absence of freedom of the press. Most intellectuals were too embroiled in politics to be bothered with fiction and poetry. It was a time for bread and not for books, as Herschel put it. That it that is precisely why Abramovich looms so large. It is he who established the intellectual agenda and artistic repertoire of the modern Jewish literary response to catastrophe. Thanks to Abramovich, parody came into its own as a preferred mode of response. Henceforth, the more closely linked a concept was to the central articles of traditional faith or to retribution and redemption, the more likely it was to be subverted, inverted, mimicked, and mocked in the face of catastrophe. In addition, those writers whose medium was Hebrew would find themselves positively tyrannized by Abramovich's linguistic achievements, so much so that parodic allusions would creep in even when uncalled for. And the figure of Mendel, the lone and learned critic of his people, would serve later writers for opposite ends. Some would make him into a visionary and prophet, and some would remove him further from the crowd so that he might see the panorama of Jewish life in all its radical nakedness. Abramovich's point of departure was the collective, its mores, its past, and its economic structure. Despite everything, and this is what characterizes the second generation, Abramovich held to his belief that if the root causes were exposed, Jewish society would weather the storm. So long as Mendel traveled the roads, the hazardous landscape could still be negotiated. The next generations, including writers like Peretz, Ansky, Berdishku, Berdishuki, whatever, and Bialik, began with a search for personal transcendence and then pitted the heroic ideal against a society that they perceived as hopelessly fragmented, cowardly, and corrupt. And that is the end of chapter 3. Stay tuned for chapter 4, The Pogrom as a Poem. Don't forget to stay in your Bibles. We are in the days of the last. Love you all. Talk to you later.